Despite the persistent racial disparities across all public systems, many people do not believe systemic racism exists. Dr. Cameron Wedding was chair of the Women's Studies Department at Sac State for 23 years. She will discuss how our implicit biases can simultaneously obscure and contribute to systemic racism. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Cameron Wedding.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everybody. I wish I could see all of you in person, but I'm quite honored that you are willing to take your time out of your busy schedules to have this conversation, this interaction with me today. So all of us lived through 2020, and we are still living through 2021. And for those of you who, particularly those of you who are my generation, I want you to think about that Marvin Gaye song that is titled, What's Going On? And sometimes I've actually played it. I should have had Chris play it today. But I just think about what's going on. I mean, I think many of us were stunned by what we experienced and what we saw, particularly in since the pandemic began, and it's not over yet. And so I decided, I've been doing implicit bias training for 15 years now, and one of my primary audiences is judges, so I've taught judges all over the country and other places. And I mean, mostly we talked about implicit bias, and we talked about implicit bias because it's softer. It's more digestible. People can, they can kind of, that was tolerable. But what we saw in 2020, particularly with the killing of George Floyd, and the police interaction and all of what, things that I didn't even know existed. I mean, there are so many things that I learned about how race functions as a result of all the events of 2020. And so I decided that it is imperative for me to transition my work from just doing the easy stuff, the easier stuff. It was never easy to talk about implicit bias. I mean, it required a great deal of skill to talk about implicit bias and to somehow avoid talking about race and racism in the way that I'm going to today. But in order for us to do our diligence and to basically serve our country well, we absolutely have to have this very tough conversation. So again, I thank you for joining me today. And I'm going to share a lot of information with you in a few short slides, but hopefully it will give you some insights that hopefully you'll walk away with at least one thing that might make a difference. Okay, Chris, let's go. And we can go right on to the next slide. Okay, so this is interesting that I have the CRT slide up, which is the critical race training. This is important because so many people across the country are having such a hard time with this concept. And I want you to know, but I've been teaching critical race theory for 23 years at Sacramento State University, for 23 years. And no one has ever accused me of being like a race baiter or anything like that. It's the whole idea of critical race theory is to be able to talk about racism in the United States, the true racism in the United States. Someone is saying that we don't have sound. Is that true? I'll let the tech people figure that out. Let me know if I need to do something else. So what we know to be true is, as of May, nearly a dozen state legislatures have passed legislation to limit how teachers can discuss racism, sexism, and other controversial issues. You've seen it on the news. We've all heard about it. The latest efforts to rein in this approach to subjects that they claim are divisive and inappropriate. This is the deal. So many of you remember the conversation, you remember like the 80s when we were first, this is I think it actually began right after the Civil Rights Act passed, when all of a sudden we were told that we should be colorblind. And they basically used Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech to say that we shouldn't think about race, we shouldn't talk about race because race doesn't matter. So a lot of us, I mean, I think in the beginning, I might have even thought that was great. That's only great. It is only a good thing to not talk about racism if there is no racism. But if there is racism, if racism continues and persists as it has, then we've got to talk about it in order to disrupt it and in order to bring an end to it. Next slide, please. So in my talk today, I'm going to talk about 7 different systems briefly, obviously. I'm just going to reference child welfare or CPS, Child Protective Services, transportation, which Dr. Martin Luther King referred to. This is, you know, in one of the speeches that was published after his death. He had referred to transportation as one of the greatest civil rights issues of our time. And so we're going to talk about why that is. We're going to talk a bit about housing, healthcare, climate change, education, and juvenile criminal justice. So I'm starting with child welfare. I've been doing trainings and working with, like I said, judges who preside over child welfare cases for the past 15 years. And this is an interesting quote or reference to a child welfare director who I met. And what she said to me, actually, she showed me her data. And the data said that Black and white children are equally likely to have substantiated allegations and recurrence of maltreatment. She also said that Black children are 25% more likely to enter foster care and 50% more likely to re-enter foster care than white children. So this is the thing. If you read the first bullet point, it says Black and white children are equally likely to have substantiated allegations. Why then are Black children 25% more likely to enter foster care and 50% more likely to re-enter foster care than white children? So that's the question that I asked this child welfare director. And her response to me was, I don't know, we need to do more research. I'll get back to that shortly. Next slide, please. So I just saw a study recently, and it talked about the fact that it reported that half of all Black children, as well as half of Native American children, experience a California Child Protective Services investigation at some point during the first 18 years of their lives. That means that half of Black and half of Indigenous children experience a child welfare investigation during the first 18 years of their lives. But compared to nearly a quarter of white children, 1 in 8 Black children spend time in foster care, a rate that's 3 times as high as white children. And the vast majority of these cases are triggered by neglect, which is very subjective. And we will, I'm going to close the loop on that shortly as well. Next slide, please. So this is the thing, poverty mimics neglect. So poverty helps tell a story about who people are. It's a narrative. So we associate poor people almost with bad people. We associate rich people often with good people, but that's not necessarily the case. I live in a neighborhood that's an amazing neighborhood in Sacramento, a beautiful neighborhood. And I have seen events and activities with children that if those things happen in a poor neighborhood, those children would have been removed. I've seen children in hot tubs unattended. I've seen children in tree houses unattended, like 10 feet high tree houses. Neglect looks different when you're looking at poverty. White professional class families are most always presumed to make the best decisions or the decisions that are in the best interest of their children, whereas poor families are often foreshadowed by stereotypes. In one child welfare agency that I worked with, we did a survey. We asked them, why is it that we have a disproportionate number of Black kids who are in child welfare given their rate in the general population. And they said, and the quote was, this was the quote, "Black families have poor parenting skills," unquote. Now, my question to you is, if you are a social worker or a decision maker, and that is your framing of that particular group of people, that they have poor parenting skills, will that impact your decision making? Next slide, please. So this is the facts. Black children were more likely to be placed in foster care even when their parents were employed, drug-free, and not receiving welfare, even when they came from small families and safe neighborhoods. And what we know historically is that Native Indigenous children, we know that they were forced assimilation in boarding schools. We know that Black children from the beginning of their time on this continent were, slavery was forcibly removed them from their families. So I want you to understand that removing children from families is not a new thing. It is part of our history, and it's a history that we don't know about because we basically don't teach about it. So many of our students at Sacramento State University don't know about these things. So many of us don't know about these things. Next slide, please. So what about transportation? That's the second system I want to talk about. So this is provided by the executive director of Walk Sacramento. And according to the director, being Black in Sacramento means that you're more likely to suffer from asthma, die in childbirth, and be killed by simply walking down the street. And she says, I'm not just talking about police brutality and violence. It's also about racism that has been embedded into every aspect of our lives, from our systems and institutions to the built environment and design practices. At the end of the day, skin color determines where you live, how you access jobs, education, and ultimately it determines your ability to live a long, healthy life. Next slide, please. This is the other thing that's really interesting and important to understand. So this is also data about Sacramento for those of you who are who reside there or are familiar with it. It says the most severe crashes occur in the city's disadvantaged communities. So you might think that, well, a crash is a crash. And I'll tell you what people often think. They think that if there's a higher rate of crashes that occur in poor communities, they think it's because the poor people did something wrong. Maybe they're under the influence of alcohol or drugs or something, just did something wrong. But what we know is that oftentimes these differences are about the fact that we don't invest the same amount of money in these communities as we do wealthy communities. We don't have the wide streets. We don't have the marked crosswalks, and we don't have the bus stops in the right place. And so Black pedestrians were struck by drivers at rates of 82% higher than whites. And that disparity for Indigenous residents jumped up to more than 220%. This is not an accident, it is by design. Next slide, please. Walking deaths fall disproportionately on those who are poor, Black, brown, elderly, disabled. They are not avoidable. They are not unavoidable accidents, but highly predictable events that tell a story. So I mentioned before the importance of where the bus stops are, crosswalks, and jaywalking is an interesting one because so many poor people get cited for jaywalking, and that is a discretionary citation. So one of the things I'm going to talk about today, I want you to do I want you to continue to do is make the association between decisions in one system and how the decision to give someone a citation, let's say for jaywalking, can impact their lives in another system. So if you give someone a citation for jaywalking, it just means that increases the likelihood that if they can't afford to pay that citation, they're going to have a judgment against them. And then if they don't show up to court, they end up with higher and higher penalties. And that is one of the ways that we get people involved in the system. So this other information that I have here is about a mother. So think of this mother, poor mother, lives in housing, got off the bus, poorly marked street, poorly lit street. It was not at night. She had been shopping on the bus. Poor people mostly commute via public transportation, unlike people who are middle class or who have resources. But the short version of the story, her little boy got hit by a drunk driver. And again, making this connection, the person who hit her child had previous hit and runs. He was blind in one eye. He had already been convicted and pled guilty, served 6 months of this 5-year sentence. The mother was convicted of 3 charges related to her son's death: reckless conduct, improperly crossing a roadway. I want you to think about how discretionary decisions impact people differently. If this was a white mother, I can almost assure you that they would have had more empathy for her and the outcomes would have been incredibly different. Next slide, please. So how did we get here? This is how we got here. Again, it's not an accident. So the one thing that we have to think about is the fact that America, we as a country, our government built a racially segregated society in which white people are the beneficiaries. Now, I'm gonna give you a disclaimer right now. In my work, I would have done anything to have said this out loud to you. I would have done anything to avoid naming whiteness, because that is one sure way as a teacher, as an educator, you can get yourself in a lot of trouble. Just think about, I can talk about underrepresented minorities, at-risk minorities. I can name all kind of minority groups and their lifestyles and the things that have gone wrong in their lives. But the moment you talk about the fact that white people have benefited from these systems, that means you are setting up a visceral reaction. But the point is, once we acknowledge this, it's in the history books, unless they kind of decide that they're going to expunge it, but it's in the history books. We know this. We know about the 1882 Homestead Act. We know about the GI Bill. We know that the GI Bill allowed some people to get educational loans so that it formed the great middle class of America. Disproportionately white people, disproportionately people of color were excluded from those opportunities. And the GI Bill also gave money to buy homes and to become homeowners. What could be better than that? So just consider that. And this is what I'm going to say. It might make you uncomfortable, like it does me a little bit, but we have to tell the story. Next slide, please. All right, so now let's talk about housing. Federal housing discriminatory practices. Sometimes we think that poor people are just poor people because they didn't do their due diligence. They didn't work hard. They didn't go to school. They didn't do whatever they needed to do to have a good life. But we rarely, before 2020, we rarely talked about restrictive racial covenants that are on houses. We rarely talked about it. Most people didn't even know. So my home has a restrictive covenant on it. I'm sure that many of your homes do too. So it doesn't mean, so they can't enforce it, but I remember when I bought the house about 20 years ago, they were passing the papers and I had to sign everything. When they got to that restrictive covenant that's attached to the deed, they wanted to pass it around me. I said, no, let me see what that is. And they told me, and it basically said, the grantee shall not have the right to sell and convey or rent said premises to any person of the Black, brown, yellow races, which prevented Blacks from obtaining home loans, not based on credit worthiness, but based on racism. So in other words, my parents would not have been eligible to buy the home I live in right now, even though they owned 3 homes. My mother specifically owned 3 homes when she was raising us. But she could not have owned, she was not eligible to own a home like the one I live in now that has the increase in property value that would have allowed her to have the kind of equity to really be very comfortable in the middle class. So it was a form of discrimination. And the whole redlining thing, every Black neighborhood, no matter the income level, was outlined in red and deemed hazardous area for housing loans. And I want you to know, you might think, well, maybe they couldn't afford it. They could afford it. They absolutely could afford it. So this wasn't about who could afford it and who could not afford the homes or the home improvement loans. This was about race. This was about skin color. As a matter of fact, even when Black families walked through a neighborhood, that neighborhood was outlined in yellow, indicating that the neighborhood was declining. That's because it had closer access to Black people. Next slide, please. So what about health? So this slide is really important because it draws a connection between housing, like housing discrimination, and health. So in the previous slide, you know, what's important for us to keep in mind is that people were living, many Black people were living very comfortable, healthy lives. And then someone had the bright idea of having restrictive racial covenants, essentially to keep Black people out of white communities. And so they weren't able to get home loans. And over time, in a short period of time, these people were no longer able to, the neighborhoods then became less comfortable. The grocery stores turned into liquor stores. The schools didn't have the tax revenue to support the school system. And a lot of the houses or the land that was owned by people of color, a lot of that land was usurped and then was turned into public housing. So in other words, this was not a passive thing that a few individuals didn't do the right thing. This was what our government did that led to these poor outcomes, including health outcomes. So if on the left side, I have people who still live in fact, they have done data. And the data shows today that people who still live in previously redlined communities in the 1930s have the highest risk for comorbidities associated with COVID-19. So they have the highest risk for diabetes, for high blood pressure, and many other health concerns. And moreover, they don't live as long. One community, the average lifespan compared to the neighboring community that wasn't redlined is 67 years old. So that means that I would have been gone like several years ago. So these things have consequences. And the fact that we didn't know this doesn't mean that we know now, and there's information out there, so we can always get more information. Next slide, please. So how does this happen? Let's just think about the role of the media. The media has a very important role. The media's role is to basically dispatch information throughout all aspects of society. So the media tells us who's good, who's bad, who's right, who's wrong. In 2020, I'm sure you remember all of the acknowledgements that people made about, and apologies for, in this case, it was Kansas City Star, sins of commission and omission. And it acknowledged that as a newspaper, it disenfranchised, ignored, and scorned generations of Black people in Kansas City. It reinforced Jim Crow laws and redlining and robbed an entire community of an opportunity for dignity, justice, and recognition. So a lot of their headlines, as they're pointing out, were things like Negroes in brutal crime, Negroes held in killing, dangerous Negroes. So imagine when that is repetitive over and over and over again. This is where we are today. People can look at Black people and see danger. They don't see, I wonder who that person is. They see danger. They see me in stores even today. And I'm sure, I haven't been to many stores in 2021, but it is not at all uncommon for people to see me my presence reminds them that they should hold on to their purses. So they will clutch their purses as if out of fear that I might try to steal their purses. Next slide, please. So how did we get here? This is a slide. This is a book by Isabel Wilkerson, The Origins of Our Discontent, Caste. And she says a caste system is an artificial construction, a fixed and embedded ranking of human value that sets the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of other groups on the basis of ancestry and often immutable characteristics or traits that would be neutral in the abstract, but are ascribed life and death meaning in a hierarchy that favors the dominant caste system. So I want you to think about that and think about is that what we're looking at right now, the here and now in our beloved country? Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through the next slides, and I am going to I want you to know, so before the Civil Rights Act, people could just say and do what they want to do. And with regard to race, we could not talk about race. We could, make people who were people of color get off the sidewalk to allow a Black person to pass. I mean, all kinds of things. We all know that. We know some of the history. But after the Civil Rights Act passed, we had to create different other strategies to make sure that we can maintain the same level of rights and access for some groups and still control this racial narrative. And so the 5 systems that I'm going to go through include implicit bias, stereotypes, colorblindness, microaggressions, and language. Next slide, please. Would you go back to that previous slide, please, Chris? So I just want to point out that institutional or systemic racism, and that's the established laws, customs, and practices which systematically reflect and produce intentionally or unintentionally racial inequalities in American society. Next slide, please. So I'm sure that most of you know about implicit bias at this point, and it's just important to note that, some people are like, I don't have implicit bias, I don't have any biases, I treat everybody the same. Yes, the research shows that we all have biases because we've all been bombarded with these stereotypes about, like I said, who's good, who's bad, who's right, and who's deserving. What are the groups that are meritorious, and who are the groups that they just want something for nothing? Next slide, please. So it is a science. If scientists could scan our brains when we see spiders or snakes, they would see that the area of our brains that focus on fear, threat, and anxiety and distrust are triggered or activates when we see people who have been the subject of this kind of discrimination. Next slide, please. Having a positive attitude does not immunize us from our biases. So we can love the Black culture, for example, but we can still associate Black people with dangerousness. We can love Latinos, and we might love their food, and we can still assume that when we encounter a Latino person that they are undocumented. Next slide, please. So stereotypes. I just shared this slide because it's a way of reminding us how easy it is to associate Black people with criminality. That is one of the most efficient systems that we developed. So in this study, it's like 60% of viewers who viewed a crime story with no picture of the perpetrator falsely recalled seeing a picture, seeing a perpetrator. And of those, 70% believed he was African-American. And so this work is basically saying, so in our brains, when we think about crime, we see Black, even when it's not present at all. Next slide, please. So we're going to show this video. And once again, this video is to give us a chance to think about how stereotypes have set our thinking about, like I said before, the people who are good or the people who are dangerous.
I'm going to start that over. Sorry.
Thank you.
Just need to set something up, make sure that that share was correct. Yep, that's good.
All rise.
Great. So this slide is to get us to look at gender stereotypes and the fact that, Black women, for example, are depicted often as being boisterous, aggressive, unscrupulous. And it also has a lot of consequences for Black women when particularly their role in public systems like schools or the juvenile justice system. White girls, conversely, are often perceived as being more innocent and more in need of protection. So we saw some of this occur with the case of Gabby Petito. And in that case, we saw that, all of the reporting that occurred when she went missing, I think in a very short period of time, when they identified the number of posts regarding Gabby Petito, there were like 340 million in just a couple of days. But when we look at murdered and missing girls and women, indigenous women, it's like they go missing for years. And in one case, this individual had been missing for quite a long time. And I think she only got, looking for the number, I think it was like in the hundreds in terms of the number of posts. So she did not get nearly the same attention as did Gabby Petito. She had 6,000 results and her name was Mary Johnson. So, what they say is that if there's a missing white woman, this is what one news reporter said, if there's a missing white woman, we are going to cover that every day. Next slide, please. We can skip over this one. So this one, I'm not going to read this, but you can just capture some of the points that I have here. It's just the stereotypes that really inform us about who Black people are. It's like whether their kids are selling water in the park, and the questions about do they have a permit, or, just it's almost like anybody has the right to basically surveil Black people in public settings. Next slide, please. And the FBI director, I think it was this year, he stated very clearly that white supremacy is the biggest terrorist threat in our country. He said white supremacy is a persistent, evolving threat and the biggest chunk of racially motivated violent extremism. But why didn't we know that? I mean, it's almost like we know that, I mean, the average person knows to be wary of the Black man who's just sitting in Starbucks, and they can call the police and have him escorted out for trespassing. But it's like, then we have this, but we didn't know this. Next slide, please. And thus we ended up with this. And I want you to know, I don't know how you feel about this, but this was one of the most disheartening, it is one of the most disheartening images I have ever seen. I mean, I've always had this trust and confidence that despite our problems, we will do the right thing. And I do a lot of work internationally, and I always stand up and say, no matter what, America, we're solid. But I have to tell you, after seeing this and after 2021, I have a lot of fear and a lot of doubt. And I know we have a lot of hard work to do. Next slide, please. So how did these stereotypes get out there? We use stereotypes to launch the war on drugs. This was Nixon's advisor. It's like, we can arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying? Of course we did. So this is how we basically use these stereotypes in order to achieve political campaigns and political agendas. Next slide, please. And this is like a newspaper that has all of the language on there: super predators, crack babies, crackheads, crack mothers, which is really very prevalent in the 80s. So a lot of people, in fact, I was doing an international group the other day, and someone said to me, it was a military group, and someone said, well, I said, why do you think we have such disproportionality in the criminal justice system? He said, Black people commit more crime. I'm like, are you sure? I mean, are you really sure about that? Or is that what you've been told? Have you ever checked it out? Next slide, please. And this, I mean, some of you might remember this quote by William Bennett, who was the Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan. He said, you could abort, if you want to end crime, this is what he said. No, he's laying crime on the backs of Black people, not just the men, but the women as well. So he says, if you want to end crime, if that's your sole purpose, you could abort every Black baby in this country, and the crime rate will go down. So that this is how powerful these images have been. Next slide, please. And of course, the new Jim Crow. This is a book by Michelle Alexander. I encourage you to read it, because what it tells us is that Black men have been admitted to prison on drug charges at rates of 20 to 50 times greater than white men. So they go to prison 20 to 50 times more than white men. And it's not that they have more criminal intent. It's just that it's easier because the stereotypes match up to Black men and young men and boys, less so than white boys. We seem to have a greater appetite to protect them. But it's not just that, it's not the length of time that we serve that's really highly problematic. It's the fact that once they go to prison, the label of being a felon is what will control the quality of their lives for the rest of their lives. And as a result of this, they are likely to not be able to get college loans. Again, thinking about how incarceration will impact them in other systems, They will not be able to live in public housing if they need to for financial reasons. And in many states, they've lost their right to vote. Next slide, please. So colorblindness, I talked about this a bit. So just think about the fact that colorblindness is a strategy to prevent us from talking about racism. And we are not colorblind. We do notice race. Next slide, please. So this is an email that I got from a judge in Michigan. And I did some work for him and for his jurisdiction. And this is what he said to me. He said, every time I visit a prison or a juvenile detention facility, I am struck by the numbers, the obscenely disproportionate number of Black inmates. He's talking about kids that we have here in Michigan. But it's not just Michigan, it's in California. It's in one place we went to in the South. It's like it was a community that had almost equal amounts of kids in terms of their demographics, and white kids, Black kids, Latino kids, just very diverse community. But the day that we went to the juvenile hall at the request of the US Department of Justice, every single child who was detained in that juvenile hall that day was a Black kid. And what I said to the judges, kind of like, you know, tongue in cheek a little bit, but it was an important question. The question was, do you have a separate juvenile hall for white kids? My point was, obviously you do, unless you're okay with this degree of racism, because we know that white kids are doing things too. Next slide, please. So let me check my time. I'm going to pass on this one and go to the next slide. So this is a slide that the quote is from an administrator, and he talked about the two-track system of education. One is an education track, one is a discipline track. And this was, I think, in Austin, Texas, and this administrator said, my students come as students and they leave as felons. So again, something to think about. They come in as students, but they leave as felons. Is that what we want for our youth? I don't think so. Next slide, please. Microaggressions. You know, microaggressions, it may sound like microaggressions are tiny, like it's not a big deal, but microaggressions are the fourth way that we can keep systems of inequality intact. It's like the everyday verbal, nonverbal, environmental slights or snubs, like people clutching their purses, people walking over to the other side of the street. So many people told me on that call last week that when they see black boys, Black men, they cross over. It's like, so you're afraid of my son, you're afraid of him, and he's like the best kid on the planet, but you've been taught to be afraid of him. And I have to confess, I have done something similar. I am not immune to it. I went to the 5th floor of Amador Hall one day and I saw a Black student, a Black person. I assumed he was a student. All he was doing was looking at the bulletin board. And because I have been socialized with these stereotypes that hurt and harm people who look just like me, I can be a perpetuator. And so what I saw was the sagging pants. I saw the grill. I saw the dreadlocks. I saw the tattoos. And my body language was not one of welcoming a student. It wasn't like, oh my God, this student, are you interested in women's studies? It wasn't that at all. It was something that said, I don't trust you. I don't know why you're here. I'm looking at him like sideways, as I say. But this is when I caught myself, I was able to make a shift. And this is what I learned from that. I learned that I can not judge the next best scholar by whether or not they sag their pants. That was my lesson. And that is something that I use every time I'm aware of my own discrimination in the moment. Next slide, please. So the fifth one is language. And this is the fifth factor that can perpetuate unjust outcomes. I'm going to just do a couple of these slides. We can go. Oh, let me just say this about this one. What you're looking at is, this is a little girl. This is a little 5-year-old baby girl. She's surrounded by police officers. And yes, they are in the process of arresting her. What was her offense? She had a tantrum. I call it a tantrum. Mr. Fox from West Virginia said, oh, I think I see a girl misbehaving. So the point is, however your stereotypes land, that's going to inform your discretionary decision-making. If you see a child misbehaving, although I still don't think I would call the police, but somebody, this was a school environment, somebody decided to call the police, and here she is. And by the way, when I showed this video to the law enforcement in Sacramento County, this was like 10 years ago, what they gave me was a list of reasons why they had to have 3 officers on one little baby girl. I think we're learning better now. Next slide. I'm going to do one slide here, and this is a child welfare slide. So the paying attention to language. Language is crucial because what you write on that piece of paper, remember, it gets transmitted from your decision point to every subsequent decision point. So in self-reporting, when working with mothers and they get to self-report about their drug use, when they talk about when the social worker was reporting what was said by the white mothers, the social worker would write in the report, no drug involvement. When they are referring to the self-report of Black mothers, what the social workers would write in their reports is, mother alleges no drug involvement. No drug involvement versus mother alleges no drug involvement. I think you can see the difference. Next slide, please. And this is a really great one. So they're all pretty good. This is just about police officers, and this is something we can apply to ourselves. Do I speak to people differently depending on who they are? Am I more respectful to some people than others? If I'm a store clerk, am I more welcoming to you because you look like you belong here versus somebody who might look like you might try to steal something? You can apply this to the judge in the video called The Look. It's like, why were people less respectful and less friendly towards him? Next slide, please. And this one, using language, this was a scripted behavior. And when the person so they had the students do the scripted behavior. And when they were describing what they saw, when the person doing the shoving was Black, the victim was white, 75% of the participants rated the behavior as violent. But when the person doing the shoving was white with a Black victim, only 17% of students considered the shove as violent. In fact, 42% of whites who shove Blacks were deemed by students in the study as simply just playing around. Words are powerful. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, and I want to share this with you. So in 2019, we took a trip we went to Kigali, Rwanda, and we went to be a part of the 25th commemoration of the Rwandan genocide. And the Hutu genocide against the Tutsis. And so they had at that meeting, Adama Dieng, who was the Undersecretary General Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide. So, when I think about what happens to us in the United States, it's like when we look at all the systems that I've talked about, all systems recreate the same negative outcomes for people of color. All of the whether it's child welfare, media, juvenile justice, education, housing, all of these systems they are collaborating, and they're reproducing the same outcomes over and over and over again. So I want you to think of it like this. So when the undersecretary said this quote, he said, indeed, genocide is the ultimate form of discrimination. So I've established, hopefully, that there is discrimination. We all live in plural societies, and there is a need to foster inclusivity. Therefore, we should promote the constructive management of diversity and remember that no country, no region is immune from the atrocity crimes, by which I mean genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. So the reason I think this is, in fact, I ran up, he was there in the front with hundreds and hundreds of people. I ran up to the front of the room as fast as I could because I wanted him to give me a personal quote that I could share with you and my other groups today. So I want you to think about this. I want you to think of this as our call to action. It may seem like it's not a big deal in America, but if we keep locking up more people of one group, if we keep making sure that Indigenous kids and Black kids are removed from their families, and we don't know the reason why, we say, well, we need to do more research, and this has been going on since slavery. Or if people who are involved in traffic crashes and accidents, or if they get themselves, if they are penalized or punished, then that means that we are putting these people at significant disadvantages compared to their white counterparts. So I just ask you to consider this our call to action. This is our time. We can make a difference. And if we work together, we will make a difference. Thank you very much.
So, Dr. Cameron Wedding, thank you so much for your presentation, both your words, your PowerPoint, the video, very thought-provoking. I think we'll all, speaking for myself, will be thinking a great deal about it. I do have a few questions from our attendees, which I would like to pass to you. This question, in a way, follows up exactly what your concluding statements were. It was a question, the person basically said, how does one start a meaningful discussion with individuals who appear to be, this is the person's words, brain dead, as to their own personal biases? How do you start that dialogue?
Yeah, that's a very important question and very difficult. You know what? It may not be them. I mean, I think our deeds, my actions may speak louder than my words. And I'm not going to reach everybody, but one of the things that I have learned is that I can't assume that people who have a different political viewpoint than me, that they're just the bad people. I'm not going to, I think I have assumed that, and I have kind of created my own narrative about these people being like really scary and dangerous, but they're, you know, I think by my own behavior, by my own deeds, by my own language, by the people I bring into my orbit, particularly if the people that I'm referring to, if they have a chance to witness that, maybe that can change some minds. But people have got to be willing to change. I just thought about that question yesterday for myself. It's like, can I really change who people are? I'm not sure right now. I think people they have to be willing and want to change. This is like religion. You know, sometimes if you are steeped in a particular religion, it's not easy to change people from whatever that religious orientation is to something else. And I think that's where we are. But I think we can make a difference with our own behavior and demonstrating, you know, like a higher calling, a higher way of dealing with this by treating each other as brothers and sisters. You know, how we feel when we go to another country and we hear that American accent, and I'm like that. Oh my God, they're American. Whoa. We need to have more of that.
So I have two more questions for you. one of your slides, one of your statements was about a shortened life expectancy.
Yes.
And the question was, is that due to a lack of adequate and affordable health care, or what are the reasons for that?
It's all of that. Oh, one of the things I didn't talk about is climate change. And climate change, I don't think I'll be able to find my notes fast enough, but part of it is climate change. And what we are finding out is that people who live in poor neighborhoods and neighborhoods that have been previously redlined, nobody has made an investment in those communities. So we were walking down the street in my neighborhood a couple of weeks ago, one of those very hot 100-degree days, and we were walking, there was one tree canopy after another. From one, like 3 blocks long at least, there was a complete tree canopy, which we were shaded all the way. And we're like, oh my God, what happens when people live in public housing and they don't have this? And what the data is showing us is that these people have higher respiratory problems. Their kids can't go outside and play, so it kind of creates other problems, or their kids are playing on concrete. They're playing, in some of these poor neighborhoods, they're still playing on these metal play sets, these swings and things like that. So it's a health issue. It's like a lot of these places don't have, in our country, some of them don't have running water, they don't have bathrooms or working bathrooms. The plumbing is faulty, and they have window air conditioners that the people can't even afford, because if you live in public housing in many places, the city or the community or the jurisdiction, they're not going to pay for your electric bill to run an air conditioner. So what the data has shown is that the increase in temperature has gone up exponentially over the last 20 years. In fact, one man who lived in a neighborhood that wasn't previously redlined, this was a middle-class white man, he said, gee, every time I go to my neighborhood, it seems like it's cooler than where I just came from. And when we first hear that, we go, oh, that's ridiculous, the air is the same. It's not the same every place. It makes a difference. If you don't have a canopy to kind of like, or if you don't have any plants to absorb that heat, that means that you are going to experience a higher rate of heat. It's going to go up higher. Not to mention the fact that if you live in a neighborhood where the transportation has run a highway through your neighborhood, that means you're suffering from exhaust, from fumes, and all those sorts of things. So all of these systems, they're all connected, and they're all producing the worst conditions for poor people.
Chris, do we have time? Because the last question dovetails exactly with what you were just saying. The last question I have was one of the attendees noting that previously highways and freeways were constructed very near low-income and minority neighborhoods. The question was, is that practice still continuing, or has it been modified?
I think there is a greater awareness of it now. There's a greater awareness of it, but we still see the high rate of traffic fatalities in poor neighborhoods. But in terms of building transportation systems, some of the people are, they feel like now they have to negotiate with this community, whereas before they didn't have to negotiate with this community, and maybe this community doesn't have the same level of representation. So I think our transportation systems across the country have a higher awareness, but I think the people who live in wealthy neighborhoods have the power to influence where those highways go. I think that's still the case, just because they're the ones who are in the spaces and places where these decisions are being made.
Thank you. And Chris, back to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Let me switch to other view. And we do want to thank you for a great presentation. It was really thought-provoking, and we had more questions coming in I think we ended up with more questions than we started with. So I know it's one that our audience is very interested in, and hopefully it's started us all thinking. So we do appreciate that. And just as a small thank you to you, we'd like to give you an honorary membership in the Renaissance Society for the next year. And you're welcome. And we'll also be making a donation in your name to the Seth Nelson Student Emergency Grant Fund.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So today's presentation was recorded. You can view it in the Renaissance Society's YouTube channel or on our website. And next week, we got a treat for you. Tom Dreesen is a well-respected and very funny comedian who appeared over 500 times on national television, including 60 appearances on The Tonight Show, 50 appearances on The Late Show with David Letterman, and opened for Frank Sinatra for over 14 years. He's also a humanitarian and motivational speaker, having published several books, including his latest, Still Standing. Tom and Renaissance music class leader Mike Agron have put together an entertaining presentation you won't want to miss. So thank you all for today, and we'll see you next week.